The incense burns. The prayers rise. But heaven seems quiet. How long can a man keep believing when his hope has outlived his strength? How long can a priest keep offering prayers for others while his own remain unanswered? Zachariah had served in the temple for decades. Every day, he spoke blessings over Israel, watched young couples bring their newborns for dedication, and whispered holy words before the altar. Yet, behind his calm face was a question that would not die. Why not us? He and Elizabeth had done everything right. Both were descendants of Aaron, a priestly line. They lived righteously before God, blameless in the commandments. Still, their home echoed with silence. No child's laughter, no tiny footsteps, just the creak of age and the sigh of years gone by. They had prayed when they were young, prayed when they were middle-aged, and prayed when their hair turned gray. And when the neighbors stopped asking, they kept praying in secret. For Zachariah, the dream of fatherhood had become something sacred and painful, an unspoken wound carried beneath priestly robes. One morning, as he rose to serve, a strange heaviness filled his heart. His division of priests, the course of Abijah, had been chosen by lot to minister in the temple at Jerusalem. Out of thousands, Zachariah's name was drawn for the honor of entering the holy place and burning incense on the golden altar, a duty some priests never experienced even once in their lifetime. To him, it felt like divine irony. He was too old for new beginnings, yet heaven was calling him closer than ever. The temple that day glowed with morning light. Pilgrims crowded the courtyards. The Levites sang psalms from the steps, their voices echoing like waves through marble halls. Zachariah stepped beyond the curtain into the stillness where only the priest and the presence of God were allowed. In his hand, the golden censer shimmered. He poured the incense on the coals, and a cloud of fragrance rose toward the ceiling, symbol of Israel's prayers. Outside, the multitude knelt. Inside, Zachariah whispered the ancient petitions: peace for the nation, mercy for the people, forgiveness for the guilty. But his heart trembled with another request he dared not speak aloud. Lord, remember me. The smoke curled like silver ribbons. The silence deepened. Then movement. On the right side of the altar, a figure appeared. No sound of footsteps, no rush of wind, just sudden presence, radiant, terrifying, absolute. Every particle of the air seemed alive with unseen energy. Zachariah froze, his pulse hammering. No mortal could stand there. This was the angel of the Lord. Do not be afraid, Zachariah, the voice said, calm yet commanding. For your prayer has been heard. Your wife Elizabeth will bear you a son, and you shall call his name John. For a moment he could not breathe. The words collided with decades of disappointment. His prayer heard? His wife bear a son? The impossible sentence shattered the logic of age. The angel continued, every phrase weighted with promise. He will be great before the Lord. He will not drink wine or strong drink, and he will be filled with the Holy Spirit even from his mother's womb. He will turn many of the children of Israel to their God. He will go before him in the spirit and power of Elijah, to prepare a people ready for the Lord. Zachariah's hands trembled. His mind flooded with the impossibilities, the frailty of his body, Elizabeth's years long past childbearing. He looked at the angel through the rising smoke and said the one sentence that would change everything. How shall I know this? For I am an old man, and my wife is well advanced in years. The air seemed to tighten. The light around the angel grew brighter, almost blazing. I am Gabriel, he declared, who stands in the presence of God, and I was sent to speak to you and bring you this good news. But because you did not believe my words, which will be fulfilled in their time, you shall be silent and unable to speak until the day these things come to pass. And just like that, the voice of the priest was taken. Before you step into this forgotten story, the faith, the silence, and the miracle that changed a nation, make sure to subscribe. because every chapter ahead reveals how belief can outlive time itself. Outside the temple, the people waited. Minutes passed, then many more. The incense should have been finished. When Zachariah finally emerged, his face was pale, his eyes wide with awe and fear. The crowd sensed something extraordinary had happened. They asked him what he had seen, but he could only gesture, hands trembling, lips moving without sound. They understood that he had seen a vision in the sanctuary. That evening, when he returned home to the hill country of Judah, Elizabeth saw the change in him before he could even explain it. He traced words on a tablet, told her everything he could. And she, barren for decades, smiled through tears. "If the Lord has done this," she said softly, "then the shame of our years will become his glory." Days turned into weeks. The seasons shifted. Elizabeth conceived, and the neighbors whispered in amazement. She kept to herself, letting gratitude grow in silence, much like her husband's enforced quietness. Their home became a living miracle, two aging hearts learning to worship without words. For Zachariah, the silence became a teacher. In it, he heard things he had never heard before. The beating of his heart, the rhythm of faith stripped of language, the echo of Gabriel's promise. Every sunrise reminded him that God's timing was never late, only different from human expectation. And every night, when he looked at Elizabeth's swelling belly, he realized that the silence was mercy, space for faith to ripen. Around them, the world continued its weary motion. Rome ruled with iron. Herod built palaces while the poor hungered. The prophets had been silent for centuries, and the people wondered if heaven still spoke at all. Yet in one quiet household in Judea, a spark of divine purpose had been rekindled, an aged couple becoming the cradle of a movement that would soon shake the world. Zachariah, once the praying priest, now became the listening one. He spent evenings in the courtyard, watching the lamps flicker, thinking of the day he would finally hold his child. He no longer needed to ask when, he only needed to trust. When Elizabeth's time came, he would be ready, not to speak first, but to praise. Because some promises are so sacred that words must wait until their fulfillment. The temple lamps burned low that evening, their golden flames bending in the hush of twilight. The scent of incense lingered on the priestly robes, and silence hovered in every corridor of the sanctuary. Outside, Jerusalem pulsed with noise, merchants closing their stalls, travelers arriving for the feast, the murmur of crowds echoing through stone streets. But within the sacred walls, the noise of the world was kept out, as if time itself bowed before the holy. And somewhere deep in the heart of that temple, a man who could no longer speak carried a message that could not yet be told. Zachariah's voice had been taken, but his eyes, they had become sharper, alive with things unseen. He had stood in the presence of Gabriel. He had seen the veil between heaven and earth torn open for one brief, blazing moment. And ever since that day, every flicker of light, every whisper of wind seemed to hum with divine meaning. He could not explain it to anyone. He could only live it. The angel's words haunted him, not as punishment, but as revelation. "Your prayer has been heard." Those 4 words struck deeper than anything he had ever read from the scrolls, because they proved something terrifying and wonderful. Heaven had been listening all along. Each morning, Zachariah still went about his duties in the temple courts. His fellow priests pitied him. Some whispered that he had seen a ghost. Others thought the years had caught up with his mind. But Zachariah didn't need to defend himself. He carried the weight of truth like a secret flame, quiet, unseen, but impossible to extinguish. At home, Elizabeth's joy began to show. Her once wrinkled face seemed younger, her steps lighter. Neighbors came by to help, bringing bread and laughter, though she often withdrew into solitude. She said it was because the child within her leapt whenever she prayed. There was something sacred about this pregnancy, something that could not be explained by chance or age. Zachariah watched her from the doorway, often writing on his tablet the words he wished he could speak. You are proof that God still moves among his people. You are the sign that silence is not absence. Every time he looked at her, he remembered that moment in the sanctuary. The golden altar, the sudden radiance, the words that both healed and humbled him. He had asked for proof. He had received silence. And in that silence, something greater than understanding was being born. Weeks passed. Elizabeth's belly swelled, and the whispers of the village grew. Some praised the miracle. Others mocked quietly. Old fools, they muttered. Perhaps they adopted. But gossip never mattered to the faithful. Elizabeth would smile and say, "The Lord has done this for me. In these days, he has shown his favor and taken away my disgrace among the people." The angel's prophecy was unfolding, one heartbeat at a time. The sign of heaven. Months later, during the festival season, Zachariah returned again to Jerusalem for priestly service. Though still mute, he was welcomed. Age demanded respect, and his piety was beyond question. When the time came to light the incense again, a tremor passed through him. His hands, steady from decades of ritual, now shook slightly. He could almost feel Gabriel's presence in the shadows. He stood before the altar of incense, the same one where his life had changed. The gold gleamed beneath the torchlight. Smoke rose and curled like a spirit in motion. His heart pounded as he lifted his eyes to the space where the angel had once stood. There was no voice, no vision this time, just silence. But it was different now. The silence felt alive. It was no longer emptiness. It was expectation. He understood now that the presence of God was not always thunder or fire. Sometimes it was quiet enough to break a heart. As he placed the incense, memories flooded him. Gabriel's piercing gaze, the shock of divine authority, the words that stripped him of pride. He had been a man of the scriptures all his life, but that encounter had rewritten everything he thought he knew about faith. He realized something. Faith was not about speaking, performing, or understanding. It was about yielding. Yielding even when heaven is silent. Yielding even when the promise seems impossible. Yielding even when your voice is gone and all you can do is stand and believe. That night, Zachariah knelt in the sanctuary long after his duty was done. The candles flickered low. The city slept beyond the walls. He prayed without words, tears falling freely down his face. He had once begged for a sign. Now he understood that he himself had become one. The home of promise. Back in the hill country of Judea, Elizabeth was nearing her time. The house that had once echoed with stillness now hummed with expectancy. Every morning she would touch her stomach and whisper, "The Lord remembers." Neighbors gathered more often now, bringing figs, olives, and small gifts for the coming child. They joked that this old couple would never keep up with a newborn, but there was awe in their laughter. Even the skeptical ones had begun to wonder if prophecy had returned to Israel. Zachariah wrote often in silence, notes of gratitude, fragments of psalms, thoughts about the future. Sometimes, when Elizabeth read them, she would weep. One of his notes said, "When I lost my voice, I found my faith." He had learned that belief was not a sound, it was surrender. And though he could not speak, his actions preached louder than any sermon. He tended to Elizabeth, prayed beside her, and prepared a small cradle carved from olive wood. Every stroke of the blade was an act of worship. As the days drew near, Elizabeth told him of dreams of light, of a child clothed in strength, of voices crying in the wilderness. She felt that her son would not live an ordinary life. Something vast was moving, something ancient awakening in the world. Zachariah would nod silently, eyes shining. He knew. Gabriel had said the same. The day heaven stirred. Late one night, the wind outside shifted. A deep stillness fell over the hills. The stars glowed brighter, almost trembling. Elizabeth woke in pain. The hour had come. Midwives rushed in. Lamps flickered. The cries of labor filled the small stone house. Zachariah paced outside, trembling, praying without sound. The memories of Gabriel's words echoed in his mind like thunder. "Your wife Elizabeth will bear you a son." Then the cry of a newborn split the air. Raw, powerful, alive. Zachariah fell to his knees. His wrinkled hands covered his face. He could not shout for joy, but his tears spoke for him. The silence that had once punished now crowned him with glory. Elizabeth held the child close, breathless, radiant. "His name," she whispered, "shall be John." The neighbors protested. "None of your relatives are called that name." But Zachariah, hearing the dispute, took the tablet and wrote boldly, "His name is John." And at that moment the silence broke. His tongue loosened. His voice poured out like water released from a dam. Praise erupted from his soul. He shouted blessings, prophecies, words he had been storing for months in the vault of his heart. The whole village rushed to see. Fear and wonder fell upon all who heard him. They said, "What kind of child will this be? For surely the hand of the Lord is with him." Zachariah's voice returned not as it was before, but stronger, clearer, and filled with heaven's fire. His first words were not explanations but worship. "Blessed be the Lord, the God of Israel, for he has visited and redeemed his people." The old priest who had once doubted now became the prophet who declared. The man who had questioned now spoke with conviction. And from that day, Zachariah's story spread across the hills of Judea. The story of the priest who met an angel, who lost his voice, and who found faith through silence. He had learned that divine promises do not expire with age. They wait, quietly, patiently, until the world is ready to receive them. The sound of a newborn's cry still echoed through the stone corridors of Zachariah's home. It was not merely the cry of a child. It was the sound of heaven keeping its word. Neighbors filled the courtyard, women with jars of oil, men with baskets of figs and dates, all whispering about what had taken place in the house of the old priest. They had seen miracles in scrolls, heard them sung in psalms, but never before had they watched one unfold in their own village. Elizabeth sat beside the window, her face turned toward the morning light, the infant in her arms. The boy's small chest rose and fell with the calm rhythm of peace. Every breath seemed to say, "God remembers." Zachariah stood nearby, unable to stop smiling. For months he had lived locked inside silence, but now words poured from him like a spring newly broken open. He sang blessings over the child, over his wife, over the world. His voice, once weary and restrained by doubt, now burned with the certainty of fulfillment. The day of the naming. 8 days later, as was the custom, family and friends gathered for the child's circumcision and naming. It was an ancient ritual, a mark that tied every son of Israel to the covenant made with Abraham. The small room was crowded, elders in woolen shawls, women holding lamps, children peeking curiously. The officiating priest smiled at the mother. "He shall be called Zachariah, after his father," he declared. Elizabeth shook her head. "No," she said firmly. "His name is John." A murmur spread across the room. "John? But no one in your family is called by that name," they argued. Tradition was strong. To defy it was to seem presumptuous. All eyes turned to Zachariah. The old man, still glowing from his regained speech, motioned for a tablet. Slowly, deliberately, he wrote for simple words. "His name is John." The moment the last letter was etched, the air seemed to shift. A stillness fell, as if the walls themselves were listening. Then, suddenly, Zachariah's mouth opened again, and words burst forth like fire. "Blessed be the Lord, the God of Israel," he cried, "for he has visited and redeemed his people." The crowd froze. His voice was thunder after a long drought. He lifted his hands and continued, the spirit of prophecy flowing through him. He has raised up a horn of salvation for us in the house of his servant David. He has spoken through the mouth of his holy prophets of old, that we should be saved from our enemies and from all who hate us, to show the mercy promised to our fathers, to remember his holy covenant, the oath he swore to Abraham our father, to grant us that we, being delivered from the hand of our enemies, might serve him without fear, in holiness and righteousness before him all our days. Then his gaze fell upon the infant in Elizabeth's arms. His voice softened, trembling with awe. "And you, my child," he said, "will be called the prophet of the Most High, for you will go before the Lord to prepare his ways, to give knowledge of salvation to his people, by the forgiveness of their sins, because of the tender mercy of our God, whereby the sunrise shall visit us from on high, to give light to those who sit in darkness and in the shadow of death, to guide our feet into the way of peace." The people listened in stunned silence. Outside, the wind rustled the olive trees, as if creation itself bowed in agreement. When Zachariah finished, there was not a dry eye in the room. Fear and wonder fell upon all who lived nearby, and throughout the hill country of Judea, people whispered, "What then will this child become? For the hand of the Lord is surely with him." The growing light. In the months that followed, peace settled over their home. Elizabeth recovered her strength. Zachariah spent his days in gratitude. Every morning, he would lift John in his arms, walking him along the terrace where the sunlight spilled over the hills. This child, he would think, was born not from fleshly strength but from divine timing. The neighbors often came to listen as he read the old prophecies aloud. Malachi's promise of a messenger who would prepare the way, Isaiah's vision of a voice crying in the wilderness. For years those words had sounded distant, almost forgotten. Now they burned with new life. John grew quickly. His eyes were sharp, his cry strong, his spirit restless. Even as a toddler, there was something untamed about him, a wildness that no cradle could contain. When he laughed, it was bright and fierce. When he looked at his father, it was as though he already understood more than words could express. Zachariah often found himself weeping as he watched him sleep. Not tears of sadness, but of recognition. He knew what this child meant, not just to him and Elizabeth, but to a nation waiting in spiritual darkness. The prophets had spoken of one who would turn the hearts of the fathers to their children and the disobedient to the wisdom of the just. He now held that prophecy in his arms. Sometimes, he would whisper to Elizabeth, "Can you feel it? The air has changed. Something greater is drawing near." She would nod. "Yes," she would reply. "And when our son speaks, the world will listen." The shadow of power. But outside their small village, the world was not quiet. Herod's grip on Judea tightened. Taxes rose. The priests in Jerusalem were divided between fear and politics. The temple that had once felt eternal now groaned under the weight of Roman rule. Zachariah knew the days of peace were temporary. Prophets never lived soft lives. If his son had truly been chosen to prepare the way for the Lord, then the path ahead would not be gentle. It would be lonely, harsh, and marked with fire. Sometimes, he would watch the boy play beneath the olive trees and feel a pang in his chest. A father's ache, knowing that the future would call his child away from safety. Yet even that pain was sacred, because it meant the promise was alive. The song of the redeemed. Years passed. The story of the miracle child spread. Travelers passing through Judea would ask, "Is this the house of the priest whose son was promised by an angel?" Pilgrims came to see John, to hear the father's story. Zachariah never tired of telling it. He spoke of the day Gabriel appeared, the blazing light, the terror, the mercy. He described the silence that followed and how faith had to grow in the absence of proof. And he would end every retelling the same way. "Do not doubt the God who delays," he would say. He delays only to prepare. People left his house changed. Elizabeth often listened quietly, smiling. She knew her husband's faith had become deeper than words. It was carved into the rhythm of his life. And sometimes, when the nights were quiet and the stars burned above their roof, she would lean against him and whisper, "We prayed for a child, but God gave us a herald." Zachariah would nod. "A herald?" he'd repeat softly, and a reminder that heaven's silence is never the end of the story. The turning of the age. The boy grew strong in spirit. He spent time in the wilderness, wandering near the Jordan, drawn to solitude. Even as a youth, he avoided the noise of the city. The desert became his teacher, the wind his hymn. Zachariah watched this and understood. The wilderness would one day become his son's pulpit. As John matured, the old priest's strength began to fade. But his joy never dimmed. He had seen enough to die in peace. Every time he looked at John, he saw proof that faith can still move the world, even in old age, even after silence, even after doubt. He would often whisper a final blessing over the sleeping boy. "Go where the Spirit leads, my son. Speak what heaven gives. And when the Lord comes, let him find you already proclaiming." And in those words lay the heartbeat of Zachariah's entire life, the fulfillment of a prayer that had waited decades to be born. The silence was long, the promise was sure, and the day had finally come when faith itself cried out through the voice of a child. The years that followed were quieter, but the quiet was not empty. It was the quiet of fulfillment, like the stillness after a storm has passed. When the earth drinks the last of the rain and everything glows with peace, Zachariah's beard had turned white as snow. His hands shook slightly when he held the scrolls, but his eyes remained clear, steady, and full of fire. Each morning, he rose before dawn to light a lamp and pray. The same man who once begged for a sign now prayed not for miracles but for mercy, for the world his son would soon confront. The boy, John, had become a young man, strong and restless. There was something untamed in his spirit, something that reminded Zachariah of the wilderness prophets he had read about his whole life. John did not crave comfort, nor did he seek the praise of men. He preferred the solitude of the hills, the open sky, the cry of the wind through the cedars. Elizabeth would watch from the doorway as her son walked toward the horizon with a staff in hand. "He belongs to the wilderness," she would whisper, and Zachariah, though his heart ached, would nod. "He belongs to God." The shadow over Judea. But while peace filled their home, shadows deepened across the land. Herod's paranoia grew darker with every rumor of prophets and messiahs. Spies listened in temple courtyards. Soldiers patrolled villages. The priests in Jerusalem grew cautious. Politics had become as dangerous as sin. In those years, Rome's taxes strangled the people, and injustice became common. The temple still shone with gold, but behind its beauty, corruption festered. Zachariah saw it all. The very institution that once represented heaven now seemed ruled by fear. He knew that when John's time came to speak, the world would not welcome his voice. Prophets never lived safely. They walked between altars and swords. One evening, while the sun set crimson behind the hills, Zachariah sat with John outside their home. The air smelled of olive wood and dust. "My son," he wrote on his tablet. His hand still preferred the ancient habit. "The world will not love the truth you speak, but speak it anyway." John, silent for a long moment, nodded. "I will, Father," he said, "even if they hate me for it." Zachariah smiled faintly. "Then you will walk the path of all who ever pleased God." That night, the stars burned brighter than usual, as though heaven itself had overheard. The call of the wilderness. The years passed like pages turning. John began to withdraw more frequently into the desert. Sometimes he would be gone for days, fasting, praying, listening to the silence. He told his parents the wilderness spoke to him, not with words, but with conviction. Zachariah knew the feeling. He had once learned the language of silence himself. The villagers whispered about the young man dressed in rough camel's hair, living off locusts and wild honey, preaching to the wind. "He's gone mad," they said. "The old priest's miracle child has lost his mind." But Zachariah and Elizabeth knew better. They had seen enough of heaven to recognize its strange ways. At night, when John returned to rest, his father would ask no questions. He would simply press his hand to his son's shoulder and whisper, "When the time comes, the world will hear you." There was a heaviness in those words, not fear, but acceptance. Zachariah knew his role in the story was ending. The torch was passing from one generation to another. He had prayed for a child. God had given him a prophet. Elizabeth's final days. Elizabeth's health began to wane as the years took their toll. Her laughter, once bright and melodic, became softer, but her faith only grew stronger. She would often tell visitors, "Do not envy the young, envy the faithful." She and Zachariah had spent a lifetime waiting on God, and they had found that his timing was always worth the wait. One evening, as the sky turned violet and gold, Elizabeth lay upon her bed, her hand in Zachariah's. Her breathing was faint but peaceful. "Do not grieve for me," she whispered. "I have seen the goodness of the Lord in the land of the living, and I have held the promise in my arms." Zachariah's eyes filled with tears. "You have been the answer to every prayer," he said softly. That night, she passed quietly, the woman who had carried the impossible, now carried home by the angels she once believed in. Zachariah buried her beneath the olive tree behind their house, the same tree where John had taken his first steps. He prayed there every day afterward, speaking to her as though she were listening just beyond the veil. The last vision. Not long after Elizabeth's passing, Zachariah began to feel his own strength fading. Yet peace filled him, not fear. He knew his time was drawing near. The same God who had given him silence and speech, sorrow and joy, would now give him rest. One evening, while he prayed in the dim glow of a single lamp, he felt the air shift, that same living stillness he had known long ago in the temple. His heart trembled. He lifted his eyes, and there, just beyond the edge of sight, stood a presence radiant as dawn. It was Gabriel again. Zachariah's lips quivered. He could barely speak. "Do not be afraid, faithful one," the angel said. "Your work is complete. Your son will walk the path prepared for him. And through his voice, the promise you carried will awaken the hearts of many." Zachariah bowed his head, tears streaming down his face. "Then I am ready," he whispered. The light faded, leaving only stillness, but it was not emptiness. It was the silence of completion, the same sacred quiet that had once begun his story. He laid down that night beside his staff and scrolls. When morning came, the lamp had burned out, and the old priest was gone. The legacy of faith. When word spread of Zachariah's death, people came from all over the hill country to mourn. They remembered the miracle, the prophecy, the voice that had once broken decades of silence. They said, "The priest who doubted became the prophet who believed." John returned from the wilderness briefly to bury his father beside Elizabeth. He stood by the grave, the wind tugging at his coarse robe, and whispered, "You taught me how to listen before I could speak." Then he turned and walked back into the desert, the same desert where his father's faith had been tested, and where his own destiny awaited. Years later, when John stood waist-deep in the Jordan River, calling Israel to repentance, his father's words would echo in his heart. "Speak it anyway." And when a man from Galilee approached to be baptized, John would feel the story of his father rise again. The same power, the same fulfillment, the same faith that believed the impossible could still happen. Zachariah's life had ended, but his silence still spoke. His faith had become the bridge between the old covenant and the new. And his story, the story of a man who waited, who doubted, who believed, became a reminder for all generations. If Zachariah's story moved you, imagine what's next. More forgotten stories of faith are waiting to be uncovered. Subscribe, and don't miss the next revelation, that when heaven delays, it is not denial. It is preparation, because every silence in faith is pregnant with a promise waiting to be born.